It doesn't matter how many times I watch The Lion King, that movie always makes me emotional. And I'm certainly not alone. The film is notorious for having two of the most emotionally profound scenes in film history. I'm sure you know the ones I'm talking about. Now, a story can only stir up this kind of emotion if it's well told. But what is it exactly that makes this story so well told? Why does it resonate so deeply and so universally among audiences still to this day? Let's find out on today's episode of The Art of Storytelling. The question of how a story works is as old as civilization itself. And the oldest surviving text we have that attempts to answer that question comes from the philosopher Aristotle. His Poetics was written around 330 BCE, and its purpose was to describe and understand the principles of poetry and drama, the highest form of which he believed to be the tragic plays of his time, works by Aeschylus, Euripides, and his favorite, Sophocles. Now, if you're thinking maybe The Lion King is not a tragedy in the same sense as Oedipus Rex or Electra, just keep in mind that tragedy isn't necessarily a sad story with an unhappy ending. Aristotle defines tragedies more generally as stories that imitate important human actions and show their moral implications. They deal with important themes like fate and justice, arousing a purgation of emotions, so that the audience leaves the theater feeling cleansed and uplifted. Now, The Lion King, with its lofty themes of destiny and responsibility, would surely have been of interest to Aristotle. In Poetics, he lays out 6 key elements of well-told stories, but most importantly, he argues that these elements should have unity. They should work in harmony with one another. So let's use Poetics as a framework for analyzing The Lion King, starting with mythos, which is essentially plot. Aristotle argues that one of the signs of a good plot is that the events in the story have a clear causal relationship, each action being part of an unbroken chain of cause and effect. We should be able to look at any event in the story, no matter how minor, and deduce its function in the plot. There should be no narrative dead ends.
You might want to work on that little roar of yours,
Even something small like Simba learning to pounce and then playfully competing with Nala pays off later in the story when the two reunite. Some of these connections are really obvious, like Mufasa telling Simba that the stars are the kings of the past, which is what eventually catalyzes Simba's epiphany. And the film has many parallel plot events, like Mufasa and Simba being attacked by Scar while hanging from a cliff's edge. But really, it's the overall logic of the story that Aristotle would likely admire. Scar tells Simba that only the bravest lions go to the elephant graveyard. Therefore, Simba sets out to prove his bravery, bragging about being king and ditching Zazu, therefore needing to be rescued by Mufasa. And this whole sequence ends with Scar watching over the entire scene, a reminder that these events are all part of his plan. The plot in this act is being driven by 2 things: Scar's sinister plan to usurp the throne and Simba's naive arrogance in disobeying Mufasa. So for Aristotle, the plot is propelled forward by the logical motivations of its characters. And that brings us to ethos. For Aristotle, good stories are driven by characters who have moral agency, either for good or bad. Characters should have clear motivations. The inciting incident in The Lion King is when Scar manipulates Simba into disobeying Mufasa's rule that he must never venture outside the Pride Land. Scar's actions reveal him to be ruthless and calculating. He's willing to kill his own nephew to get the throne. And likewise, when Simba chooses to sneak off to check out the elephant graveyard, his actions reveal that he's impetuous and he overestimates his own bravery and strength.
I laugh in the face of danger.
I know it seems almost redundant to point out these characteristics, but that's only because the ethos of these characters is so clearly rendered by their actions that to describe their motivations and characteristics is merely to state the obvious. And that clarity of moral purpose is what Aristotle means by ethos. Next up is dianoia, or theme. It's the idea at the heart of the story, its message. And one common criticism of bad stories is that they kind of beat you over the head with their message. They lack a kind of subtlety. Well, Aristotle would say that simply having a message isn't enough. What matters is how the message is articulated through the events and characters in the story. For Aristotle, a story's dianoia should emerge organically from the action in the plot. It's like an emergent property of the mythos and ethos of the story. And that's certainly the case in The Lion King. It's pretty clear that the main theme of this story is the interconnectedness and continuity of life. The very last event in the plot is Simba having a son of his own, thus completing the circle of life. And it really matters that Simba is a lion king because his royalty encodes his divine right and destiny, a life that one is meant to live, a potential which, according to the laws of nature, ought to be fulfilled. When Simba is exiled, hiding from his guilt and indulging in the pleasures of Timon and Pumbaa's hedonistic lifestyle, we understand intuitively that Simba is denying his true nature. Timon filing down Simba's claws isn't just a funny gag, nor is the fact that he has to survive by eating bugs. The Hakuna Matata scene has so much fun and humor that you don't even really realize that Timon and Pumbaa's philosophy of no worries is bad for Simba and represents the denial of his lionhood. Aristotle would approve of that because the central idea of the story isn't being told to you. You're along for the ride. For that part of the movie, you are singing along with Timon and Pumbaa and their philosophy that life can have no worries for the rest of your days. So you're primed for the crushing disapproval of a stern father figure. And that means you're actually engaged with the story's core ideas, or dianoia. Now, we're talking about an animated film here, so a lot of its ideas are going to be expressed through the next element, opsis. This is the spectacle or visual quality of a story. So Aristotle would have been thinking about things like costumes, set design, props in his own time. But of course, this can include any visual technique, including animation. Aristotle was a fan of aesthetic harmony. He believed there should be coherence of visual elements in a play, and that they had an important role to play in helping the audience to understand the story's themes. One of the main criticisms of the 2019 Lion King film was that its photorealistic animation failed to humanize its characters, and that film was generally not well received, despite many of the other elements of the story being identical to the 1994 film. I think I felt more emotions playing the Lion King Super Nintendo game than I did watching that movie. Now, Aristotle would tell us to look at how the visuals integrate with the other storytelling elements. When Rafiki cracks open the baobab fruit during Simba's presentation, the sun is directly behind the fruit. That's not only because it's aesthetically appealing, it's also because the sun is a symbol for the divine right of Simba's kingship. His legitimacy as king is recognized not only by his fellow animals, but also by the natural world itself. And that speaks to the broader themes of destiny, the circle of life. I also love this image of young Simba stepping in Mufasa's paw print. So much is said about Simba's character in that moment without a single word, just through the power of opsis. Now, that's not to say that words don't have their place. Aristotle's next element is Lexus, which means something like diction or expression. It's about how the story is told using language, not only the word choice, but also how the words are said. It's hard to imagine Scar's dialogue working as well as it does if he didn't have that pompous aristocratic accent.
Oh, I shall practice my curtsy.
And it's hard to imagine Timon's dialogue working without his cynicism.
When the world turns its back on you, you turn your back on the world.
Like all good Lexus, the dialogue in The Lion King is written to be universally relatable. It's broadly metaphorical so that it can speak to everyone in the audience. Early in the story, Mufasa tells Simba that
everything the light touches is our kingdom.
Note the generalized language. The viewer is being invited to interpret those words metaphorically, whereas if he said something like, everything from the mountains to the ravine is our kingdom, it wouldn't have that poetic quality. Anybody can relate to the line, remember who you are. That's much better than remember that you're a lion or remember that you're the king. And Simba doesn't respond by saying, how can I return to Pride Rock? I'm not the king. He says, how can I go back? I'm not who I used to be. This dialogue is written so that you, the viewer, can directly identify with and therefore empathize with Simba's character, so that in effect Mufasa is talking directly to you. And that's really the key to making the audience feel genuine emotion. While we're on this scene, let's talk about melos, which is something like melody, music, or song. Yes, even in Aristotle's time, the Greek tragedies did include musical accompaniment, sometimes written in collaboration with the author of the play, and much of the dialogue was sung by the performers. It's actually considered one of the great tragedies of history that none of the musical notation for those plays survived. So what we have is sort of like the libretto of an opera, the dialogue script without the music. In any case, Aristotle is referring to the musical score in much the same way we think about film scores today. And of course, we all know The Lion King has one of the best soundtracks of all time. Elton John and Tim Rice co-wrote the film's show tunes, so Circle of Life, I Just Can't Wait to Be King, Hakuna Matata, Can You Feel the Love Tonight, and Be Prepared. But it's Hans Zimmer's original score that we hear in the most crucial dramatic moments of the story. And if you listen closely, you'll hear a few key motifs, recurring musical ideas that are associated with particular ideas in the story. There are 3 specific motifs to listen for. The first is the theme of death and loss, which we hear first in the heartbreaking scene where Simba realizes Mufasa is dead. And then we hear it later when Simba returns to the Pride Land and finds that it's dying under Scar's reign. Now, the second theme is that of spirituality, and we first hear this motif when Rafiki draws Simba inside his baobab tree. And the next time we hear it is when Rafiki believes that Simba is dead. The third theme is one of destiny. It's the most common musical motif and is generally associated with the image of Mufasa. We hear it first when he teaches Simba about the Pride Lands and the Circle of Life, and when he tells Simba that the stars are the kings of the past. Now, Simba's vision of Mufasa is the most important scene in the film, and all 3 of those motifs occur in the span of 30 seconds during that scene. First, when he sees his own reflection in the pond, we hear the theme of loss.
Look hard.
Then the theme of spirituality when he sees Mufasa's face in the water.
He lives in you.
And this leads seamlessly into the theme of destiny when Mufasa appears as a vision in the clouds.
Father? Simba.
Hans Zimmer is synthesizing all of the story's key character moments and ideas into one all-important dramatic moment, Simba's turning point. And that's the unity of form and function that Aristotle holds as the highest ideal in storytelling. It's the integrity of all those separate parts, the plot, characters, themes, language, visuals, and music, all working together harmoniously and with clear purpose. And that is what makes you cry. That's what makes you identify with Simba and his story. That's how you relate the action on stage to yourself, so that you can process it psychologically and emotionally. And when Simba finally does take up his responsibility and rejoins the Circle of Life, we get that all-important catharsis, the purgation of emotion that is the central aim, in Aristotle's view, of tragic storytelling. So next time you bawl your eyes out during Mufasa's death scene, think about Aristotle and remember that stories like this one are such a fundamental part of our humanity that they've been studied and understood and described by scholars for over 2,000 years. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more videos about storytelling, and I'll see you on the next one.